Alexander as a kind of phonological symbol. And this one is given by Colin Rowe, who is the kind of Corbusier design for the United Nations, and there is various readings of that. Basically, it's difficult to see. There's a one way of where you look at this as axial along this axis. He actually created a garden with hedges, which creates a parallel symmetry. So there's a kind of series of spaces on axis. You move this way, and at that point, this doesn't belong. That isn't part of it, and you have to imagine, there's a kind of landscaping completion of this symmetry here. So you would have a kind of Beaux-Arts style symmetrical composition or Versailles style, palace style condition onto that axis. He's done something similar along this axis as well. So here is another axis, and here's a landscaping piece here, so you can do that there as well. But then there's another reading which he offers, which is, let's assume that these are different slabs, linear slabs in this direction, and they kind of shear against each other. So this also looks like a dynamic equilibrium composition, like the Bauhaus and so on we discussed last time, where you don't have symmetry and proportionality, and you have this kind of where you can attach here, you could attach here, you can attach here. This kind of so that's the third way. This is kind of a dynamic equilibrium composition, and you kind of have these planes slipping and sliding against each other, and there's no sense of a Beaux-Arts or Versailles style composition here. So these are two very different readings of these compositions, where each time there are certain things belonging and don't belonging to that. So in the symmetrical piece, this doesn't belong; it's out of sight also. Now we've done an exhibition design where we tried something like that. First of all, there's an obvious diagram of interpenetration, superposition, a series of walls which dissect the space. They kind of compete in that dissection, and they generate emergent spaces as well. So there's different readings of this. One is just this series of walls which dissect, and as a set they're quite similar. They always these kind of thrust through the space from one end to the other. And they've then been developed more three-dimensionally. And they were also affiliated because there was already something thrusting through this space, which was a kind of tube overhead. So we created a system of 1, 2, 3, 4 walls doing something similar to this one, which is thrusting through that space as walls. This one turned into kind of ramp, and they intersect each other. Then we did another order. We superimposed a gradient from light gray to dark, which captures all of them subdues all of them. They're no longer individuals. They participate in that overall color gradient from left to right. And then there's this kind of reading where we emphasized, maybe not so clear, but there's an emphasis of the segments which emerge, the space segments, the rooms which emerge out of this intersection game. You focus on these. So you could either see a wall as a unit, or you see the space as a unit, right? And now this piece, and this piece of wall, and this piece of wall collaborate to create that room. So the room is an assemblage out of these walls, but this piece, at the same time belongs to this. So this is an integral. So there are different decompositions of that overall composition, and different, which reconstructing units of interactions differently. and the way these were articulated, there is kind of interpenetration, intersections. So you don't have to make the full wall. You can kind of continue the top part to maintain the integralness of the overall wall, for instance. It's a very early work. And this was a idea. Not only do these different readings of this, there are different utilizations of that. So there was, each of these walls had a topic in an exhibition. So there were information trajectories and storylines. So they had the function of gathering along their lengths a certain topic. For instance, there was an exhibition on technological utopias, for instance, and there was, for instance, the dream of flying. There was lots of, Icarus, and there was Tatlin and aircraft and Brothers Wright and so on. There was robots on this one. I forgot what the other one, other ones were. Doesn't matter. So they were. But then when 4 or 3 of them gathered a space in now different parts, various aircrafts and robots and a third category were gathering. They were also meant to be selected according now to the theme of that room. For instance, 19th century, something like that, as a synoptical work rather than a kind of. So this is therefore the utilization of this multiple decomposition scenario to have a more intricate and complex organization embedded, rather than having only one story in a sequence. We have 2 organizational structures operating, and the position of the intersection, for instance, might be that this particular robot is also part of this story. There's the integralness of the wall, there's the integralness of the room, there's an overall gradient from left to right, and all in the same space, rather than each space next to the other in a story. So in this sense, it was similar to also the Parc de la Villette, where you have several ordering systems, not next to each other, but over each other and competing and structuring the same space differently. And of course, again, you need here is also tied up with different phenological readings of the structure of that overall territory. Is it a structure of 5 walls, or is it a structure of serious room patches, or is it a structure of a gradient? That simultaneity of operation was interesting. Now, you can see here that this kind of interpenetration overlap is also something which Eisenman worked with a lot. To look very closely at this. For instance, look at this rectangle here. And the way this curve pours through, and you have this. So this bit here is obviously an overlap. It belongs on the one hand to this sausage moving, which is similar to this sausage. At the same time, it's part of a rectangle, which is maybe similar to this and this. So there is a patch of space which belongs to 2 systems. And you could say, 2, it could be a third one and so on. That gives this kind of multivalency, multifunctionality, which I think could be the subtext of working with assemblages. Because the point of the assemblage is that they come together, they act together. Here they don't even have to move. The reassociation is not by they're moving into a new constellation. They're just in several constellations at the same time, even though not moving, they just need to be looked at differently by users, by observers, by participants. So in this sense, you can create these kind of assemblages, multiple interpenetrating assemblages, as a concept for designing something. So, which is very different from designing an organism, which we're usually asked to do. A house, where the number of rooms are clear, the elements which need to be there are clear, the relative place proportions are clear, and the overall unity is a singular unity, and there's never an ambiguity that this kitchen is the kitchen of this apartment. And now we're talking about something where, first of all, this piece could be on one hand the kitchen of this apartment, and then could be or a kitchen of an apartment, and at the same time maybe a kind of lobby for that temporary event or something. So there's several descriptions, and where also the number of parts in the scene shifts and changes from one description to another, from one scenario to another. So it is no longer denumerable, the elements, because it's, Alain Badiou as a philosopher, he's problematizing this. This in the contemporary world. It's only in something very, very stereotyped, and where everything is organisms, you can actually count. So you need to, you can count apples. You know what an apple is, or do you count two because there's the apple and the stem, the nipple, or you're counting. It's all very conventionalized. How many things are on the table? Should you, 1, 2, or is this one? Or is this one, or is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? So it becomes what is a part, and so there's a natural way of counting because these are organisms, like the laptop. You can name it, but in these kind of compositions we're talking about, or the Cubist paintings, it is everybody counting would count different. You could say the trivial accounting before was, yes, there's a guitar player. There's only one object in there. They say there's a guitar player and the guitar, there's two objects. So that is so in the world of the assemblage, particularly the multiple interpenetrating assemblages, you can count easily. There's one scenario of counting, and usually the counting would be to count the parts. First of all, to count the overall. The wholes are what works together, what is integral, supported by a perceptual recognition. And then if you start counting parts, the parts are usually also have a function, a designated sub-function of the overall purpose of function. That's the way you count. Usually that's the way. Questions?
So basically, like, let's say in Iceland, this kind of collage was less like trying to develop a language, a semiotic language was auto-referential. Sometimes you don't even think about the user or how they read the architectonic elements.
Which collage you talking about?
Iceland.
Iceland.
So you're saying that actually what we should, taking inspiration of this assemblage, but you're saying now that we should actually look at that from the user point of view. So that is the assemblage of organisms in a way. Of
proto-organisms, of, let's say, units of interaction. We decompose the scenes into units of interaction, but there could be multiple such decompositions. They're not just purely visual. I mean, if, for instance, if I'm going back to the Eisenman thing, he might just do that kind of willfully. He's done that interesting overlap condition. Now, when I distinguish two readings of this surface as one belonging to this system of rectangles, or being a rectangle, part of a rectangle, or part of that overall curved thing, I call it sausage, then there should be two purposes. So, on the one hand, the car park, which maybe this is the covered area of the car park, and this is the open carriage. And then there's another thing which ties this function together with this. So I want to align with every phenomenological integralness should mean something. Should be instrumentalized.
Isn't power.
Isn't the power.
So something wasn't working?
No, just power.
Maybe it's for the better. So yeah, that's the ambition. I'm not just into playing visual games or something like this. Although initially, I accept, that's what the painters were doing. That's a good, and to some extent, the Cubist painterly experiments, which had, like all art to some extent, has not many tight purposes. They're kind of random mutations, browsing. To some extent, they're proliferating exaptations. They're not instrumental, but the culture needs that. So then they inspire somebody who's then putting it to work. So I'm somebody who's putting to work some of these discoveries of, for instance, visual multiplicity or visual latency, what Colin Rowe called phenomenal transparency, and putting in turn and tying and creating assemblage between this and the discourse on assemblages and for instance, the social conditions of network organizations. So we kind of plug together now into a discourse series of influences that's very similar to that process of assemblage. You want to say something? Yeah.
Well, I've been thinking about my question.
Okay.
Whether I should ask it or not. Well, I'm thinking about our projects in relation to adaptation.
Yeah.
And I noticed that certain projects in our office, they kind of seem to be more designed as an industrial design object. You know what I mean? It can be anywhere. Some projects they are more adapted to the environment where there is food, And in a way, I'm just thinking how to relate this kind of to adaptation.
Well, okay. Now you're using the word adaptation a little different from when I was using it earlier, but let's say context affiliation is something which, although some of our buildings have a little bit this, appear more object-like and autonomous, there's always some degree of embeddedness of the object into a kind of a landscape with itself created, and that ties in with prior site features like topography or incoming roads. That's an a priori. That's where we differ in parametrism from modernism, where modernism would allow itself to be just landing an object and maintaining its purity of, for instance, square shape, no matter how odd shaped the site is, no matter if there's topography or not, etc. And we don't do that. So there's always an element of context affiliation adaptation, and this should be, I think, I mean, to be then also ties in with the story of creating operational connections with the context. So this building starts to function with this context and creates degrees of integralness, and that could be expressed through formal affiliation. Now, I mean, there is again this interesting story which came out in deconstructivism. Let's say you have this. The modernism was kind of willing to go tabula rasa and be irrespective of a context which it thought would, in a particular historical context, which it thought of as temporary and to disappear anyway. And everything would to be remade in the image of the modern. And then there's a certain organizing structures like a grid or something. That sensibility changed, and in the postmodernism you wanted to kind of go back into the historic centers and respect that this would exist, and you build up a kind of complexity and re-embed. And there was this idea of adapting and fitting into. Now what was interesting in the next step was that when there was this kind of going back into complex historic urban conditions with an intervention, this idea of context affiliation became complex because this particular already, let's look at the late 70s and 80s, you had already some modern buildings, some historical buildings in different periods, so there wasn't a uniform context to affiliate to. So this was an interesting problem. So you had a site which had on different adjacent parcels quite different urban neighbors. So you had to, what will you do now? Which one do you kind of assimilate to? And that brought the idea that the new intervention should reflect the complexity of its context. So you bring lines in from all sides, but also maybe you affiliate. You make this new building a chimerical creature which is similar at the same time to all. Or it absorbs this complexity and becomes a morphing from one side to the other. For instance, that was our idea. But in deconstructing, it was more these different orders were copied into the site and they just clashed and overlapped and interpenetrated. So you would want the sort of complexity was derived from a complexity that was a kind of intensified intersection of context conditions. And then in parametrism or in folding, it became a kind of chimerical morphing of these different sides, 3 or 4 sides, or this idea of a multiple affiliation. And there's some nice, I don't have it here now, but maybe next time I can. Let's see, it goes back now. A competition design, for instance, by Kipnis, where he's very explicit. So it looks quite rich, so that it has different reading capacities. And I should show it, but it seems to, you can read it similar to different sides, depending on which features of this complex thing you focus on. It's another story. I should show you that image. And that's one called multiple affiliation. You see a little bit in this condition here, this kind of morphing idea of something between landscape and building. It's kind of nearly like a building, but then becomes more like a landscape. And you create a field where this is not so distinct object background, but something becomes an object out of a kind of animated texture background. So it's a bit like that curious painting. So is this an object this is clearly object against background, but this is more object than this, and this is kind of surface and field. So there's this ambiguity, what crystallizes object-like out of a background. This is a little bit like this where I played with things like, where is the kind of, there's obviously something kind of, these are just kind of grids and overlapping and distorted grids, but they crystallize kind of objects, clusters like this. They don't necessarily have a clear boundary, but you don't know exactly which elements belong to it. But maybe at certain moments, underlined by lighting or by use, they congregate, and in other moments they kind of suffuse into these things. So this is another one where you have kind of aggregations which create entities which are less crystal clear than you have in a kind of Platonic universe of cubes, cylinders, and so on. And so this is the idea of allowing for gradients. So you know that you're in a territory, but you don't know exactly where the boundary is. You know you're part of an object, but you don't know exactly the expanse of it. It doesn't matter. It's fuzzy logic. So more or less, it's kind of good enough. So that could also be allowed for. Doesn't need to be kind of crystal clear each reading. And then we did this kind of field conditions where again this kind of conditions bleed into each other, field qualities transmute, evolve, continuously change, yet you can also kind of try to dissect zones, but it's not crystal clear, so it gives you freedom to draw the zones out. So we moved from these kind of collages into these field conditions, where you have kind of gradients, but they're still kind of entities like a solid, a void, but it's kind of something in between. Questions?
Can I?
Yeah.
It's not exactly the questions, rather some observation of these two seminar, and the question, like, if I understood it correctly, because the last seminar was more about, let's say, organism, like more, let's say, adaptation, yeah, and there was kind of opposition between, as I understood it at the beginning, as organism as something like, as example of something organized, like proportional, let's say, consistent, as opposed to assemblage, which is kind of chaotic, unpredictable, temporary, and of course, especially in relation to architecture that we do here, in these rules of the game we're playing, of course, like organism was an ultimate choice. But actually today's explanation, what are capacities of assemblage, and are actually like lead to conclusion that assemblage is could be quite a systematic thing, quite controllable, quite predictable in terms of planning, that it can be planned, like a double functionality, for instance.
Yeah.
And in this case, it actually can become so organized that it actually become a part of organism, like, and it's a kind of round up, and then we come to this idea of the cars, which is exactly the joint between assemblage and organism. So at the end, it could be the part of organism at the end.
The car is a very typical organism by now. The evolution of the car is shown that it started as an assemblage, like all organisms start as assemblages. But the point is a little bit true. I mean, what is true is that the assemblage is surprising, temporary, etc. And as it routinizes, it becomes like an organism. Now, what I'm now talking about is if you have, let's say, two or three interpenetrating organisms. They obviously, that the pieces are now oscillating between.
They can again create either an assemblage or a folio.
And that means they're less fixed, less strong. But you could have a scenario, yes, where